Welcome to Senate media availability. It's good. It's, I think, day 10, isn't it? And we're moving forward. I've asked Senator Thatcher to come in to talk about asset forfeiture, and so we don't have a lot of time, but give us a summary of what you're trying to do with your bill.
Well, the short version is we want to raise the bar. Currently in the state of Utah, there is not a requirement that there be a criminal charge attached to an asset forfeiture proceeding, and I think we all agree that that's not what we want. Now, in practice, Salt Lake County showed the number of cases they had with civil asset forfeiture where the what word do we want to use to describe the person from whom a forfeiture occurred? The accused, there you go. In cases where the accused did not flee the jurisdiction or otherwise abscond, criminal charges were filed in almost every single case. So the question is, why would you ever not file charges? Typically what we find is in cases where there are not charges filed, it's usually cases over $10,000 that are large multi-jurisdictional cases, huge drug busts involving the feds. One of the things they told me is if wiretapping is involved, then there's no way they're bringing this thing to trial in a year. Usually there are plea deals. And so how do I solve the problem for the 90% of the cases out there that are under $10,000 while I'm trying to find a solution? Well, I think the best way to do it is to bifurcate it. If it's over $10,000, we leave the statute as it stands while we look for a more clever solution. However, in the meantime, for the 90% of cases that are under $10,000, let's just require that within 60 days of the forfeiture, there be a criminal charge or an immediate return of the property. I think that's pretty darn good.
Any questions regarding
How does your bill differ from the House bill that apparently is a committee bill? Why are there competing?
Well, I want to be clear. It's my opinion that that's a committee bill because they didn't know there was another option. Everyone agrees we need to do something, but I don't think people that actually sit down and look at the details, the mechanics of how the two bills will actually apply, think that these are equal in any way. One was done with complete collaboration and cooperation with the enforcing agencies, and that's why I think it executes so much more elegantly. The biggest difference in my bill is the early resolution opportunities. If you simply say that you can't have your property returned until after being cleared on a criminal charge, well, the criminal case is going to take a year. So you can't get your stuff back until you're cleared in a court of law? Now, if you flip that and you say you can't take the property until the case is resolved, how many drug dealers do you think are going to leave their cash so that we can still come back and get it after a conviction a year later? That's silly. That essentially ends forfeiture in the state of Utah, which I believe is a huge disservice to the public. So under my bill, there is the early return opportunity. And again, I want to credit Anna Brower, or actually I think it's Thomas now, Anna with the ACLU, for the idea that the biggest problem is people that don't have resources don't even know what their first step is to argue their innocence. So we have required that part of the forfeiture process where they are given a receipt for seized property includes instructions on the back on how to dispute. I think that's very important. It's a very important access to justice portion. Secondly, your first step is you call the prosecutor and you say, I'm an innocent owner. I wasn't buying drugs with that money. Okay, maybe I stopped to grab a joint on the way home, but that's the money that was seized wasn't drug proceeds. That's my rent money. Well, you ought to be able to show that you took $400 out of your bank account. That's pretty easy to show, and the prosecutor in that case is instructed to return the property. If they do, then the forfeiture is resolved literally that day. Done. If the prosecutor does not believe you, then it goes to the civil case. The civil cases are resolved very quickly, usually within about 45 days. So within 45 days, you're in front of a judge, and a prosecutor has to prove that the money seized was criminal proceeds. And if they can't prove that with the highest level of civil burden, which is clear and convincing, then the property is immediately returned. However, because the prosecutor failed to return property at the early resolution option, they now have access to request full attorney's fees and full recompense for any court costs incurred.
And that's in your bill?
That is in my bill, and that is not in the Libertas bill. So that's what happens when you actually bring together the people who do this every day and say, how can we raise the bar? I would never have come up with ideas like that. Those ideas, those solutions actually came from the law enforcement community and from prosecutors. They want to raise the bar on themselves. They want to increase the standard and, frankly, their service to the communities. So it's easy to paint them as villains if you don't really ever talk to them or work with them. But I'll tell you, they've come up with a really great solution that will allow us to continue serving the public, both by taking criminal proceeds and applying that to fighting crime, and in ensuring that innocent owners get early and often opportunities for the return of their property.
Any other questions on asset forfeiture?
I apologize, that was super wordy.
No, it's a good explanation of what the bill does.
It's a good bill.
And just maybe quantify, like, if you got any statistics on how big of a problem this is in Utah?
In terms of cases of abuse?
Yes, where they're not given access to their property.
Do you know, I have actually never seen a validated case of abuse from Utah. I've seen horrible cases from other states, and I've heard terrible allegations in Utah that once you actually talk to the agency, they say, yeah, let me tell you the rest of that story. Most of the time what you hear is not accurate. And so personally, but here's the thing, I don't care if there's a case of abuse in the state, because our statute would allow it. If there were a prosecutor who chose to abuse this section, and if their city or county looked the other way, hypothetically, this could happen in Utah. So I don't care if it's happening or not. I care that it could. Well, under my bill, it can't.
And is there any training component with law enforcement agencies on, when it's not appropriate to seize, property in a vehicle? Is there any additional training that would be required as part of your bill?
Not as part of this bill, but let's be honest. Every single year we do make changes up here that affect law enforcement, and every year our post goes through and reviews their training procedures to account for the changes that we've made. I see no reason to bring that into it. They're pros, they'll handle it.
They're used to us making changes.
We do it every year.
Any other questions in the media?
Ask Senator Stevenson about budget goals. I saw a story that you set a goal of 30 million in funds that you'd like to see entities give up to make available for reallocation.
We've actually found additional money, but we don't have an exact number on that yet. I would remind all of my legislators, though, that or all the legislators, that day after tomorrow is the final day for appropriations requests, and after that, the requests we will then start to go through the vetting process and see if we can't put some of these in an order that we can understand them and get the important things to the top. But as far as a number, it's very difficult. We're still in a very preliminary stage. I don't know if you've said any of the committee meetings, but staff came up with quite a few items that they thought could be made we could use for cuts. Most of those we didn't think would fly to begin with, and we've assured ourselves of that they will not fly. So there just isn't going to be a lot of money. I don't believe there'll be a lot found. And we'll have to wait to see what the projections come out in February.
So that $30 million figure.
Well, you know, that's just a hard number. I think that was probably less than an educated guess, but it'd be wonderful if we could find that kind of money to work with.
I just know he's staying later and coming earlier than he has in the past, so.
And I know that I've noticed Senator Hilliard skips out of here early in the evening, so it's,
He seems a lot happier too,
he does.
right?
Anyway, it's just a difficult year. There just is not a lot of cash.
And is there a sense, I know before the session started, there was a lot of talk about dealing with more money for education, looking for ways to do that. Is that still the goal of any additional revenues found, that you would redirect that toward public education to help?
Well, I mean, I think, I don't want any confusion in this. The state's had a great year. We've had good growth. And we think, $285 million roughly to use. And out of that $285 million, education, if you just look at our budget, you would think that at least 2/3 would be appropriated to education or something in that range. They get 2/3 of the budget. A lot of the funding sources are dedicated to education. Those will continue to go there. So I think there's probably there's a good chance that education will be kept whole. We seem to work really hard to try and do that every year.
But the thought before the session started was you had to find a way to get closer to that $750 million that the initiative would bring in. You had to look for new sources of revenue as well as maybe reallocation of existing funds.
I think that, and there may well be, but we will have to evaluate some tax policies before we get to any new sources, and that will come later in the session, I think, Lisa.
May come next year or the year after. Those are hard issues.
The growth is in the education fund with the income tax. We're also seeing and hearing, haven't got anything substantive yet, but general fund continues to struggle with growth in the sales tax, and I think we're going to be forced to have to deal with that either this session or next session if we're losing the base and the main revenue source for the general fund. Because what happens is we just start funding higher ed more with education funds to make up that difference, and so that kind of works in reverse than what the initiative would do. And that's part of the problem why I think we're seeing an initiative at this point is we've seen that transfer of money out of the education fund through higher ed and funding general fund and transportation items.
Senator Brambl's sales tax bill is up in committee this afternoon. Is that something as leadership support, that bill?
Well, it has my support, and I think the Senate will, with a few maybe dissenting votes, will be voting for that.
I called Jonathan Ball yesterday and talked to him for just a minute about, just for instance, severance tax. Well, how much has our severance tax changed? And in the last year, between 16 and 17, we've seen $100 million decrease in the funding or in the collection of severance tax. Now that's mostly because of oil prices, a reduction in the amount of coal being taken out. I'm not sure exactly what that's made of, but it's made up of the minerals we extract from the state. But $100 million is a lot. It was, I think, roughly 171 or 72 million at the high in 2016, down to about 100 or down to 71 million in 17.
Which is also a general fund item, and it hasn't had a huge impact, even though it's dropped a lot because we dedicated some of that to the endowment. That was a constitutional amendment a couple of years ago, but still, I think it reflects some of the challenges we'll continue to have in the general fund without dealing with the shrinkage of our base upon which we build those revenue streams.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, Senator Adams, you talked about how difficult this is, and I know President Hauser, you brought this up as well. are there bills in the works at this point to address some of these structural issues beyond this sales tax bill, for example? I know before the session, you suggested maybe raise the gas tax, maybe look at putting the sales tax back on food, state sales tax back on food. Are we gonna see those
I
things
don't
this
see
session?
any specific bills other than maybe somebody might have a box car that potentially could be used for. Right now, the discussions are about where the money would be spent. I saw some information on that the other day. They're still working on a list of things, of targets where the money would be sent, what potential outcomes are there. That's what I'd hoped would be the beginning of the discussion. Once I think that's settled, then we'll talk about how we get that funded. But at the end of the day, as I've mentioned here before, politically very, very, very difficult for the legislature to. We did raise revenue taxes 2 years ago. Very, very difficult. I was very proud of the legislature doing some things that we needed to do that may not be popular with some elements of our constituency. But in order for I can't emphasize enough that the legislature, I don't believe, is going to act without the public being very, very supportive of the specific proposal. So that's where we need to work on it. I think that Education First and others who are weighing in on or the impetus behind the initiative, I think they have an interest. We all have an interest in educating the public so that there's support for either the legislature doing something or initiative going forward.
And I think it's better to look from what I would maybe term a holistic approach, meaning looking at all the tax revenue. Senator Stevenson talked about the severance tax and the fact that it's diminished. That could be tied into, obviously, the Bears Ears issue and the fact that we have a lot of federal ground, and inside of that federal allocation, the land the federal government owns is state lands, and the revenue off those state lands goes to the trust fund this president talked about. And those trust land monies, the revenue off of those, at least as we put it into the trust, the interest off of those goes back to education. You start to diminish that, the number becomes bigger. We've struggled over the years. We've actually tightened our belt significantly. I think not many people know that rather than go for tax increases for transportation, we've taken the general fund money and put it into transportation. There's about $600 million going into transportation. And the gas tax is a real problem in many regards to try to implement. One is the public perceives it as a tax and not as an inflationary adjustment. The other is you have to be able to be competitive with your neighboring states, or you put your service providers, the service stations and gas providers, as in a non-competitive status. There's obviously toll roads that have been looked at, and I'm actually an advocate for toll roads, but it doesn't have public support. And so, but if you look at the entire tax structure, there's got to be, I think it has to be looked at on a broad basis rather than just specifically an income tax.
So we have a minority party member who has a bill that addresses, is it Senator Backus? What does he want to create a graduated rate?
Yes, he wants to go back to the graduated tax in the state of Utah. He believes that's one of those issues that will get us back with the amount of money that we need, and it's a fair tax to do as well. I think the one thing is we bought off on the idea of a flat tax in the state of Utah at 5%. The effective rate is 3.8%, which is not a flat tax, because we continue to look at and give tax credits against that. And there's a number of bills here this year that also have tax credits on it, which only erode the base of public education. We need to look at those issues.
Which is one area I'd be in favor of, is expanding the base there, reducing the deductions, keeping the rate the same, but by reducing the number of exemptions and deductions, you actually increase the effective rate. So I think there's some merit to that. If we're going to go down that road, that's probably the road I would hope that we would go down. Senator Jones, a couple of years ago, had a bill to limit the amount of exemptions. Same concept as we're discussing here. And as I've mentioned before, I think that that's going to be a big part of this discussion. It just was probably a couple of years ahead of its time.
And I think one of the things in the voted, that's being proposed, the referendum that's being proposed, raises the tax 7/8%. But you still keep those deductions in place. So how much further are you going to get ahead if you keep those? I mean, if you raise a 5% to 7/7/8%, you raise new monies. But if the effective rate is 3.8 and you continue those deductions in there, have you really raised anything more than just your rate?
So some of those deductions are fairly near and dear to people. We have large families in Utah, and to limit the deductions or lessen those deductions for individual exemptions for children and for household members, I think are near and dear to people. Mortgage interest rates, I think there's a real philosophy behind trying to encourage people to own a home rather than rent it. Charitable donations, that's I think near and dear to a lot of people in Utah too. So as we have that, as we suggest that, there's a lot of stakeholders that need to be involved in the process. I think that has to happen, I really do. I think we can try to make those decisions as we go through that process as a legislature. I think there's going to have to be a lot of public input. Nobody's
saying it's going to be easy, that's for sure.
Well, it sounds like time-wise, I know we're only on day 9, but it's still getting late in the process to start something that would be completed this year on exemptions, correct?
Well, I think if you got some public support for that, and we could get the stakeholders around supporting something like that, I think there's still plenty of time. I think your question goes to, can we get the stakeholders, the public, to be supportive of that in such a short period of time? I think that's your biggest challenge.
And President, what are you watching for as far as public support? I mean, what are you using to measure the temperature of the public?
Well, you hear from constituents all the time. How many email do we get a day?
A lot.
That's a good indication of what's going on out there. I know sometimes it's a minority of the people that are expressing things, and the majority of the people don't always weigh in on the issue. But that's one way we'd look at it. You would also see organizations like the Chamber and Education First maybe taking out ads so that people are being educated. A commercial or something that is trying to help public opinion towards those issues, which we haven't seen anything like that yet, mainly because I think we're all still working on what the initiative would look like. So those would be some indications.
It's easier to say no than it is to actually act and make things happen.
Absolutely.
So is anyone actually driving that here in the Senate side?
No one in specifically, but we're driving this discussion. At least I'm involved in it, and Senator Milner's involved, and the other members of the leadership team in taking this first step and where the money would go and how it would be spent and what the potential outcomes would be.
We're on the other side of the aisle, we're looking at the same thing. We're talking about how best to make this happen. We recognize there's a need for increased funding in public education and higher.
And once we've settled on that, then the discussion goes towards the revenue streams.
Any ETA on when you'll have an agreement on what those outcomes should look like?
I don't. There's a draft. I saw a draft. I've seen some of the discussion items. I think it could be fairly quickly, maybe by next week, we could settle on some things. Or at
Senator,
least have them out for legislators to talk about.
yeah, Senator Milner probably has a better idea.
Okay, end of this week, you think?
Probably not the end of this week,
end of
probably
next
into next week, I would think. Hopefully.
Good caucus.
Lot of interest and a lot of opinions. Do we have any questions from any viewers?
Oh,
No
yeah.
questions today.
Okay, all right, thanks for being here.
I think it's because I put them all to
It's really
sleep.
difficult.